call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is the messenger more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. As you know, for this season of Lent, we have been looking at the celebration of discipline that is written by Richard Foster. And this week we are going to be talking about the spiritual disciplines of submission and service. And of the spiritual disciplines, the discipline of submission is the most abused and most misunderstood. So I hope to help with that a little bit this morning. The purpose of any spiritual disciplines that we have explored so far, or that we will continue to explore during Lent, is freedom. We are to center our focus on Christ and view the spiritual disciplines as a way of drawing us closer to Jesus, drawing us closer to his heart. You might ask, what freedom is there in submission? It is the ability to lay down that terrible burden of always needing to get our own way. There is an obsession in demanding that things go the way that we want them to go, and that can be seen as one of the greatest bondages in our human society today. We are human. We have that tendency that it has to go our way. We fuss and we fume. We get mad, and then we stew over some little thing that didn't go just the way we wanted it to go, possibly to the point of an ulcer for some. We all have these tendencies as humans, but when it gets out of hand, it becomes an obsession. In the discipline of submission, we are released to drop the matter, just to forget it. And let's get real. Most things that we stew over really weren't worth the stewing over. It'd be nice to have a bowl of stew instead of all the stewing that we have done. We need to determine what are really genuine issues and what is just old stubborn self-will or selfishness. In submission, we are at last free to value and to respect other people. Their dreams, their plans become important to us. We rejoice in the success of other people. We weep with them in their sorrows and in their times of trouble. We discover that it's much better to serve our neighbor than to have our own way. It means that we're free to obey that command of Jesus that says we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And it means that we can understand how it is possible to surrender that right to get even. Our opening prayer this morning that you shared in was from Mark 8, verses 34 through 35, in which Jesus says to the crowd that had gathered and to his disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me." In this statement, Jesus calls us to self-denial without self-hatred. That self-denial is simply a way of coming to understand that we do not have to have our own way, and that our happiness is not dependent upon getting what we want. And we shouldn't be upset with ourselves in that process either. Jesus gives 3 conditions for true discipleship in this passage. First, we must surrender ourselves completely to him. Then we must identify with him in his suffering and in his death. We must follow him obediently wherever he may lead. If we live our lives for ourselves and we continue to be selfish, we will lose ourselves. But if we lose ourselves for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of the gospel, we will truly find ourselves and we'll find our identity in that. Self-denial does not mean that we lose our identity. Did Jesus lose his identity as he set his face toward the cross? Did Peter lose his identity when he responded to Jesus asking him to come and follow me? Did Paul lose his identity when he became a follower of Jesus? No, they didn't lose their identity. They found their true identities in that act of self-denial. Submission and being a servant go hand in hand. Jesus lived out a very total reversal of the contemporary notion of greatness. Leadership is found in becoming the servant of all. Our epistle lesson this morning that Janet read from Philippians tells us of the symbol of radical servanthood, the symbol of the cross. But please notice, Christ not only died a cross death, he lived a cross life. The way of the cross, the way of a suffering servant, was essential to the ministry of Jesus. He lived the cross life in submission to all human beings. Jesus was the servant of all. Jesus blew away the customs of his time and the cultural mores of his day when he lived out that cross life by taking women very seriously. He listened to what was going on with the women of the day. He was willing to take the time to say, "Let the little children come to me. I want to hear what they have to say too," and have them on his knee. And then taking a towel and a basin and wash the feet of his disciples. The cross life is a life of voluntary submission, and it is the life of freely accepted servanthood. If a husband and wife love each other, they're going to live in consideration of each other's needs, and each will be willing to listen and to give in as is needed, because they have a great respect for each other and for each other's opinions, and they'll listen to that, and they will work things out together. Submission and service work and function together, and we're going to move on into the subject of service this morning, but I want you to notice in your bulletins that you've got some pink sheets in there. And as I said, we're using Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline. And in that book, he has identified 7 acts of submission. And he's also identified 9 types of service. We don't have time during a message to go into those 7 acts of submission or those 9 types of service. So that's your Sunday afternoon reading, should you want to do that, or maybe your devotions tomorrow, to learn a little bit more about how Richard Foster looks at that. And then as we explore service, Foster started off his chapter on service with this quote: "Learn the lesson that if you are to do the work of a prophet, what you need is not a scepter, but a hoe. And that comes from Bernard of Clairvaux. If we were to, and we did, symbolize submission with the cross, then a towel could be used to symbolize service. When Jesus and his disciples gathered together for the Last Supper, the disciples were having some trouble deciding who among them was the greatest, to the point that they were arguing about it. If you wanted to look in Luke 9, verse 46. Most of us know that we're not ever going to be the greatest, but we are human beings, and we certainly don't want to be the least. Sandals don't keep feet very clean, and each of the disciples were very much in need of having their feet washed that evening. And who do you think generally washed the feet of others? Those who were considered the least in that culture or in that group. Yes. This evening at the Last Supper, during the time of the Passover feast, was no different. None of the disciples wanted to be considered the least among their peers in that upper room. So Jesus quietly took a towel, took a basin, and in that evening he redefined greatness. Having lived out servanthood right there before those disciples that evening, Jesus then called them to a way of service, as we heard in our gospel reading from John this morning, and especially in the part that was, "For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Jesus was asking the disciples to go beyond themselves, and he is asking each and every one of us to do the same. Service brings us to the mundane, the ordinary, the trivial, and even to some with some really dirty, stinky feet. Foster states that if true service is to be understood and practiced, it must be distinguished clearly from self-righteous service. There is a difference between self-righteous service and true service. Self-righteous service comes through human effort, but not from the heart. It expects external rewards, and it runs around saying, "See what I did? Look what I did," for that human applause that we humans need. That attitude can fracture a community. It can fracture a family. True service comes from a relationship that is very much deep within us, through God calling us, leading us, and we follow with all our heart, with our heart wide open. It expects nothing in return, and it's humble, and it ministers simply and faithfully because there is a need. True service builds community. It can help build a family. More than any other single way, the grace of humility is worked into our lives through the discipline of service. There's a transformation that is occurring within us because we become aware of a deeper love and a deeper joy that we can find in God through that service to others. Service is not a list of things that we do, but through serving, we discover many things that need to be done. Service is not a code of ethics, it's a way of living. To do specific acts of service is not the same thing as living in the discipline of service, because it is one thing to act like a servant, but it's quite another thing to really truly be a servant. I will remind you that on the second pink page of your insert are those 9 types of service that Richard Foster has identified. And again, that's for your reading pleasure, to take this message a little bit further and to see what types of service that Richard Foster is looking at. Jesus calls us to live the cross life in submission and in servanthood. He calls us to the ministry of the towel. Each of these ministries flows from the heart, and its life, and its joy, and its peace, a peace within. This morning, as we share Holy Communion together, just as Jesus did with his disciples in the upper room that evening during the Passover feast, he truly lived out servanthood for them. I ask that we come this morning to this time of sharing the table together, seeking how we can live out our cross life and the ministry of the towel within our congregation, within our community, within our families, wherever those 2 ministries or those 2 disciplines need to be lived out. Because it's truly wherever God leads us to take up our cross and follow him. And as we prepare for Holy Communion this morning, let's turn to page 7 in our hymnals, where we find the affirmation of faith and